Game over. Game over. Lights out.
Yeah, that's fine.
You've just been completely obliterated publicly.
Shut up while I'm talking, right?
You're claiming that resurrection stories are unique to Christianity. That
No, I didn't say anything like that. I
hope he's not
are
saying
unique to Christianity.
Brenda,
That
you're not even trying. Brenda,
the willingness to martyr yourself is unique to Christianity. That's your claim?
no, Brenda, you're so blunt. I mean, again, it's very much
Yes.
like one of these young Earth creationists in the way that they argue. It's so blunt and sloppy that it's useless. No, I'm not doing that. I'm not saying anything like that. You're completely
What are you
misrepresenting how
talking
I'm
about?
arguing. Here's the best way for me to represent what's going on. I'm telling you that there are easy, no matter what evidence you give for Elvis or Bigfoot or whatnot, there are easy naturalistic explanations.
You
for
said that
what
already.
you're pointing to. There are
And
not.
I asked you, what's the difference?
I think we're saying there are also easy naturalistic explanations for a mass hallucination.
It's just
okay,
weird. When you
I
say easy, are
mean,
you saying they shouldn't be given credence? Like, what are you trying to say?
we can observe, if you see it as a cult, right, which in some respects it might have been a cult, we can see people going completely nuts in cults, believing all sorts of fantastical things and killing themselves. So we just have evidence that this is human behavior. I don't know.
Let's get into a specific here. I mean, again, you're trying to make it so broad that it becomes useless, much like the young Earth creationists.
No,
let me here.
Of cult.
Let's do your best. You can mimic this. You can mimic this, but I want a specific from you. Give me an example of evidence for one of these situations you're talking about that it actually happened. You can go with Elvis if you want, and I'll show you how I can undermine it.
Okay. Can you give me one primary source of the resurrection of Jesus?
But before we do any of that, can I just get clear? What is the theistic? What is the theistic explanation for the phenomenon?
Can you get louder, Jack?
Sorry. What is supposed to be the theistic explanation for whatever it is? These sightings or.
Oh, for the apostles seeing Jesus alive from the dead?
Yeah.
The Christian explanation in general is that God raised Jesus from the dead and Jesus made himself known to them.
So God raised Jesus. Okay. And so, why is it that that's a good explanation on your view?
I would say it's the best explanation because the naturalistic alternatives are far inferior and they're really hard to swallow.
Well, let's just say, rather than any specific naturalistic explanation, let's just say that it has a naturalistic explanation, right? Why would that? Why would the idea that God raised Jesus from the dead be better than that it has a naturalistic explanation?
What I would do is I think the probability of there being a naturalistic explanation, the probability of that is the conjunction of the disjunction, I should say, of the individual naturalistic hypotheses, whether it's hallucination or illusion or any of the like. And that disjunction, each of the disjuncts, is highly, highly, highly implausible.
And why is that the case, that it's highly implausible?
Well, I just look at each one of them.
You're saying that that there are like you're not counting in that kind of calculus naturalistic explanations that we haven't come up with yet. Is that the idea?
I am, but I would put that in like maybe there's like a 1% chance of there being some naturalistic explanation we haven't considered. All I have to do is
generate.
Sorry, you cut out, Jack.
How do you generate that probability? Just out of curiosity.
I mean, it's kind of like the inference that we do whenever we're wanting to explain something. Like when a detective does anything. I mean, there's always, you do your best to try to come up with the possible explanations for a situation. And if there's no you get a pool of options, and you do your best to come up with the best explanation. There's always, you could have things like the alien hypothesis, but that doesn't stop us from reaching conclusions based on the pool of explanations that we can consider. So is there a possibility that there's an explanation that nobody's just thought of? Absolutely, sure. You got to leave that open. But I do think we've put a lot of thought into the sorts of things that could result in this data. And I think we've got a pretty good feel for the landscape of possibilities, because we have reached the point where people are saying, could it be aliens that raised Jesus? Could it be time traveling humans that raised Jesus? Could there be, we've really worked hard to exhaust the possibilities. And so the amount of the probability space that goes towards, it's some unknown hypothesis, that's going to be less than 1%, I think.
I'm just trying to understand as to how you're getting that number.
I don't know. It's subjective probability. So it's the same thing that you do, Jack, when considering a pool of hypotheses and coming up with the best explanation. This is a famous problem in philosophy, by the way, in IBE or any type of inductive reasoning. It's not just here. It's the question of how you have all the possible explanations. Well, if you run that argument, Jack, you can't reach any conclusions at all, because you never can say, maybe there's anytime you try to reach a conclusion, you're like, well, maybe you didn't have the full pool of explanations. So just be careful about how you run that argument.
How you got to 1%, that's all. That's just what we do. It's just subjective. Oh, okay. So you mean it's not so you're just saying this is your calculus. It's not necessarily.
Yeah. I think that's like a reasonable, I just introspect and think, how likely is it that there's some explanation out there that none of us have thought of, the whole of humanity asking about this question, and that it's a plausibly true explanation or something. And I think that there's like a 1% chance that there's something of relevance that we could find, probably even less than 1%. I think we've got the good pool of options at this point.
So
You're also really quiet, Jack.
Yeah, well, it's kind of difficult for me right
That's
now.
better.
It
was almost better. There you go.
Just out of curiosity.
By the way, I'm gonna take a break in a little bit, just to give you a heads up.
Do you think that Christianity? Do you think that this hypothesis works in a kind of progressive research program of Christianity?
Did you say a progressive research program?
Yeah.
I think you might be using research program in like the technical sense. Is that like that philosophical technical sense?
Yeah, that's right.
Remind me how you define a research program.
So there's going to be a set, sort of like a core set of hypotheses, right, which are supposed to explain phenomena. We can call that kind of like the hard core, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then what we do is we look for corroborating evidence, and when we encounter anomalies that seem to be inconsistent, we can adopt auxiliary hypotheses to account for the anomalies. But if it's a progressive research program, when we adopt those, that's going to actually generate prediction of novel content. So that's going to generate novel predictions, which can be corroborated. Otherwise,
mm-hmm.
the auxiliary hypotheses will be ad hoc, and that's supposed to be like the mark of a degenerative research program, or regressive research program, right?
Uh-huh.
So I'm just wondering whether you understand Christianity like that.
I'm tempted to say yes, but I'd have to give some thought to it. I don't know if I'm working within that kind of exact framework. Like, I'm not sure what all baggage gets carried in there. But at first glance, I acknowledge real quick. I'm a Bayesian in my approach, so that's, rather than speak about research programs, I just prefer a general Bayesian approach, but I think the concept of a research program and auxiliary hypotheses and the like, I think Bayes can capture that really well. So I think they play nicely together, and I'd probably be fine with it. I'd probably be fine with affirming something like that.
Well, could you give me an example of like how the resurrection hypothesis on Christianity, the idea that God raised Jesus from the dead, fits in to a set of novel predictions?
How it fits into novel predictions? No, I don't know that. I don't know that. Yeah, I don't know if I'd be able to make any. It's a historical thesis, so I'm not sure. You can't necessarily make predictions when it comes to a lot of theses in history. What you do is you come across data and you work out the best explanation based on the data. Like, oh, this figure existed. Well, how do what predictions did that generate based on his existence? I don't know. There doesn't need to be any new predictions. We've got this tomb with his name on it, so I believe he exists now. Based on the evidence.
It doesn't actually figure into a progressive research program.
Yeah, you're probably right about that. It's not a scientific theory, if that's kind of what you're talking about. That's right. You're right.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think here it's just going to be hard for me to understand, right, without something like novel predictions, why I would think that, I would just take kind of Gregory Dawes's view on this kind of thing, right, where I would just sort of think about naturalism generally and, whether naturalistic explanations generally, right, account for phenomena, and then think about to what extent for me to overturn that kind of commitment to naturalistic explanation, right, what that would actually require.
Mm-hmm.
And see, without something like novel predictions, it's hard for me to see, without sort of a progressive research program in which a supernatural hypothesis, right, is progressively corroborated by the acquisition of new data and so on. It's hard for me to see why I would ever, if I could even take the hypothesis seriously, because I imagine that if I asked you what to lay out sort of metaphysically what kind of commitments would be required to accept the Christian hypothesis at all, I doubt I could even understand it, right? Like, I assume. I mean, we'd have to figure out, like,
Let's not get in there. Let's not get in there just yet. Let's talk about what you're going on.
So I mean, if I could even, I would just have to bracket all my sort of kind of metaphysical, whatever metaphysical commitments I have that are inconsistent, or reasons why I think that Christian God could not exist on logical grounds, right? If I bracketed all those concerns, I'm just not clear on how, without a progressive research program, I would come to believe that a supernatural explanation in some given instance should be preferred to there being a likely naturalistic explanation, whatever it is, right? Because I might not take a view on what it is, right?
Can I ask, how consistent are you in using this criterion of fitting into a progressive research program? Is that required for you to have various historical beliefs?
Well, no, but what I'm saying is that when it comes to historical beliefs, I have a commitment to naturalism generally, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is going to be validated on these kind of Dawesian grounds.
Yeah, and I've read Dawes's book, but just so you're kind of throwing up an overarching epistemology and sort of argument for naturalism, but I wonder if this criterion of a progressive research program is a good criterion at all. And I mean, it certainly isn't something that you use in any fine-grained way, because, for instance, you don't even use it to reach everyday beliefs, as you walk throughout your day. You don't use it for thinking about history, like reaching historical conclusions as such. You use other forms of reasoning. But if you're just making an argument for naturalism in general, that's fine. I would just say, hey, what are the premises of that argument, so we can dive into it.
Well, I mean, it's a point similar to Oppie's point about worldview comparison, right? So I'm just saying, if we compare Christianity to some, basic atheistic framework that, let's say, I have, right?
Mhm.
For me to think that because there's some phenomenon that I don't have an explanation for, right? I'd have to meet Dawes's criteria, right, for what counts as a good theistic explanation, right? And predictive novelty is going to be one way that I'm going to have, very strong grounds for overturning the framework that I hold to, right, which has, a track record of predictive success, is ontologically economical, parsimonious, all this stuff, right? Predictive novelty is going to be the kind of thing that I'm going to be looking for to convince me that a theistic explanation is worth taking seriously. But it doesn't sound like you have that.
Well, let me say, I don't know, when you say Dawes is, let's back up. Is Dawes giving a particular version of inference to the best explanation? Because you laid out some virtues, some IBE-like virtues just now. And of course, Dawes, as it sounds like, when he talked about I'm remembering this from the book now, that he kind of laid this out. And I should say real quick, Dawes is not like some grand scholar or something. He just approached this himself, and it's not like anything he says has any sort of establishment in philosophy. But I'm okay with of acknowledging that if some theory makes predictions, that's really good for the theory, but it's not a criterion by any means. And the best thing we can do, Jack, is use canonical inference to the best explanation, which doesn't talk about prediction. It talks about explanatory power. So you can wrap up predictive success inside of explanatory power, and the framework of IBE fits into what I think is the most fine-grained and accurate way to do things, which is a Bayesian approach. So IBE is kind of like the lay version of it's like the easy to grasp version of Bayesianism. I think all the virtues of inference to the best explanation have a correlate to numbers in the Bayes approach. But I don't think predictive.
When you say that it's not a criterion.
When it's not a criterion. So if you mean by, hey, something has to meet a condition for it to be a best explanation, I don't think that there is anything along the lines of a criterion in that regard when we're looking out into the world and trying to make sense of it. Lots of things we believe in, and rationally so, don't form predictions, aren't the result of predictions. So I don't think that's anything like a criterion.
Well, by criterion, you mean something like a necessary criterion for good explanation. Is that what?
Yeah.
Yeah,
right,
that's not
right.
what I'm saying. Right? I'm just saying that that's the kind of thing that I'd be looking for to overturn, right, what might be called the progressive research program of, methodological naturalism or something.
Oh, I'm okay with methodological naturalism as a well, at least in the sciences, as a research program. I'm actually quite for it. But as a philosophical thesis about the world, when we're not talking just about science, we're allowed to pull in all the resources of epistemology and coming to know things. Yeah, I don't see any reason to be methodologically naturalistic there, which would basically just be metaphysical naturalism at that point.
Yeah, so look, I'm not a metaphysical naturalist, but the point is, if I'm going to appeal to some kind of supernatural phenomenon as, right, what I'm going to want is something that strongly moves me out of what is a progressive research program in the sciences and explanation generally, which is something that's going to exclude the admission of supernatural entities as explanatory, right?
I think you're going to be better off.
It's hard to see how there are any constraints on them, right?
Okay.
I mean, once you start admitting supernatural entities, it's hard to see. It's hard to see how you can continue having a progressive research program at all, right? Because it doesn't seem like, for instance, you have things like testability, right?
So
that's why I was asking about novel predictions, because if there were successful novel predictions, right, that would seem to me like potentially extremely powerful evidence for a hypothesis.
Yeah, I agree that it's powerful. But I don't know why you need to run off to the language of research project and auxiliary hypotheses. Why don't we just stick with regular, good old classic inference to the best explanation, or just regular, good old?
I'm trying to get you to grant that Christianity is not a progressive research program.
Yeah, and so if by progressive you mean something that's pretty unique, to the sciences, I think, in terms of like auxiliary hypothesis, yeah, it doesn't fit here. But I don't see that as a problem. Really, if we're wanting to be rational, then we want to use IBE in general. And I think that Christianity comes out as a best explanation using canonical IBE. Right? I mean, you look at plausibility, you look at explanatory power, you look at explanatory scope, you look at just those virtues of a theory. You weigh them out against the best competitors you can, and you get your best explanation that way.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to understand. So as a general set of explanatory virtues, if we look at a general set of explanatory virtues that included things like predictive novelty, parsimony, ontological economy, integration with our background knowledge, a track record of predictive success.
I think you're reading from Daz right now, aren't you? That's Daz's. Yeah, that's not canonical. Daz, I think, added some stuff. Again, I don't see him as a famous philosopher or anything. He just wrote this side book, and I was interested because it's called Theism and Explanation, I think, right? So I was doing a paper on theism and explanation, so I ended up reading his stuff, but he's not like an influential philosopher or anything. And by default, I think we need to be focusing on just canonical.
This
canonical
is the view that I have. Right, I have a view that's I think very close to Daz's. So I just want to understand, as far as Christianity goes, can you show me how Christianity meets kind of Daz's criteria for what counts as explanatorily virtuous a virtuous explanatory hypothesis. Can you show me how that meets Daz's criteria?
Yeah, very possibly. And I'm glad that a second ago you acknowledged by criteria, you're not saying like a necessary condition. So something can be a best explanation even if it has no predictive, fulfilled predictions, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, what I do with you in that case, and of course, we're not going to be able to do this here, and I'm going to take a break here. But basically, what I do is I talk to you about the plausibility of God's existence. I talk about how the explanatory power of theism is, really high, and at the end of the day, the explanatory power and plausibility of the resurrection is really high. I would go through those lists of things that he gave.
Yeah. So, with respect to predictive success, with respect to predictive novelty, we would have nothing, right?
Which is true of a lot of domains of knowledge. So that's not a bad thing at all. What matters is, like you said, you take into account all the virtues, and so I would say these things are going to be the best explanation even without predictive novelty.
Yeah. Okay.
Even by Dawson's criteria.
Let's just cross that one off, right? Now, integration. I'm sorry. A past track record of predictive success.
I put that in the same kind of category.
No, that's not novel predictions and a track record of predictive success are two different things. I'm sure you'll remember that from Dawson's book.
Okay. Yeah. No, I don't think that they're. It's kind of like in history when we come to historical knowledge. A lot of what we believe about how evolution unfolded and so forth really justified strongly evidenced beliefs. But yeah, I don't think that you necessarily are going to have that sort of predictive. So no, I don't think that applies.
Okay. Ontological economy.
Can you read off his whole list of things just so ontological economy?
Yeah. So testability, background knowledge, past success, simplicity, ontological economy, informativeness.
So where does he include explanatory power?
Well, I think that's what he means by. You mean explanatory power is a specific virtue. I'm not sure that's on this list that I have in front of me.
I mean, that's the most important thing of evaluating a hypothesis is explanatory power.
Well, I'm not. You have to explain to me how you understand that.
Well, it's the capacity of the explanation to produce the explanandum.
Well, but I want you to explain.
I mean,
to me,
it's in other words, it's like if it's the case that John is the murderer, then that obviously has a lot of power to explain why his fingerprints are on the murder weapon, because it makes far more probable that there would be fingerprints on the murder weapon. That's like one of the most important features of evaluating a best explanation is how much does it increase the likelihood.
Yeah, but
he might be conflating.
I thought we were understanding explanatory virtues as probability raising.
But that's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. But by the way,
I'm wondering, if you're saying that an explanation is explanatorily virtuous, are you saying something different from it being explanatorily powerful?
Explanatory virtue is wider in scope, and explanatory power is a kind of explanatory virtue.
So I assume you're going to want to appeal to something more than it being probability raising. Is that right?
No, explanatory power is, I think that corresponds to probability raising, but it's not the fullness.
No, but I'm saying is, do you think that something being explanatorily virtuous, right, raises the probability of the hypothesis being true?
Yeah.
Yeah, so then if you're going to distinguish explanatory power from something being explanatorily virtuous, you can't appeal to it being probability raising alone, because that's going to be true of all the virtues, presumably.
When I'm talking about probability raising, I'm talking like in the case of the of the murderer, the idea of if he's a murderer, so it's like conditional. If he's the murderer, then it's more likely that he's his fingerprints would be on there. I'm not at that point. I'm not actually saying haven't reached the point of saying that he's probably the murderer. What I'm saying is that it predicts the evidence.
Yeah, but I'm just trying to get you to explain to me what it is that you mean by explanatory power.
I see explanatory power, just as, again, using the same example, as something, as a part of an hypothesis that would make the data more expected. But that doesn't mean that the hypothesis is true. It doesn't increase the probability directly. You need to increase the probability of the hypothesis being true. There's a difference between the likelihood of the evidence on the hypothesis and the likelihood of the hypothesis on the evidence. And when you're talking about what?
Well, I'm trying to understand,
I think
right? Because, I mean, if you're just saying that X predicts Y, that's presumably very weak, right?
I know. I don't know what you mean by. You mean it's not sufficient to get you a best explanation?
I'm saying that's going to be very weak evidence for a hypothesis, right?
I mean, no, I don't know about that.
Well, I mean, like if this is you never heard of the expression in philosophy of explanation that evidence comes cheap?
Yeah, but what I understand by that is that we shouldn't, like earlier in our discussion, I acknowledged very quickly that when someone prays or has an experience of Allah, that's evidence for Islam. I would just say it's very weak evidence,
Yeah,
and in
so
that sense, evidence
so
comes
right.
cheap.
So what I'm trying to understand is how are you saying something any different? If you're just saying that God, well, I assume the hypothesis is going to be something like God has the desire and the capacity to raise Jesus from the dead. He has no stronger competing desire, and he's a rational being, and therefore it's expected that Jesus would be raised from the dead, given that set of that set of propositions that constitute the explanatory hypothesis, right?
Those are stronger than I'd go for, but what are you asking about it?
I'm saying that I'm just trying to understand how that's any different. Like if I say shoe stealing fairies, if my shoes are missing, right, and I postulate shoe stealing fairies that have the desire to steal shoes, are powerful enough to steal shoes, let's say are mostly rational, and they have very strong desires relative to their other desires, right, to steal shoes, that's going to strongly predict missing shoes.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, so I mean, that just doesn't seem to me to be very interesting to say, oh, well, we can postulate some phenomenon that strongly predicts the explanandum, right?
Well, it's
I'm
one
going
of
to
the
be
most
interested in are the other things on Dawes's list, right? In
Okay,
order to
no,
see
you
if
need
it counts as a good explanation, right?
no.
So,
They have
in
a
other words, for
relationship.
Dawes,
Here, real quick,
for
Jack.
Dawes, it's going to be a necessary condition, maybe, that whatever it is that's posited to explain does actually predict the phenomenon in question, right? But what makes it a good explanation or not are going to be these other things.
Okay, yeah, I have a different perception of this. The way these virtues relate to each other is a bit more like an equation that multiplies three variables, and it's each of the variables is extremely important to the final number. It's true that if you have two gigantic numbers, x is a big number, y is a big number, and then z is 0, then your final number is going to be 0. Okay, I get you, but that's not to say that the first number, explanatory power, is not of interest. It's of vast interest. It's one of the most.
It just seems to me that it's just going to be a necessary condition for a hypothesis to count as explanatory, right? Is it's going to have to predict the phenomenon.
It is, and if you have some explanation of something that only hey, if this hypothesis is true, then there is 0.00000001 of the data being observed, then it's not as good of an explanation, or that is a feature in which it's not doing very well relative to an hypothesis that, if it's true, would lead us to expect the data to it's 0.5 that we'd see this data based on that explanation. So that captures what explanatory power is, and it's one of the most important features next to prior probability for determining if it's a best explanation overall. But I say that because if I'm hearing you right, Gregory Dawes doesn't even include it. Now,
he doesn't
I
take
say
it
that with
to
a
be virtue. He takes it to be a necessary condition.
Well, but it matters how. Yeah, but the strength. I mean, the strength at which something has its amount of explanatory power is one of the most important things you can ask. You can't just say, does it have some explanatory power? You have to ask how much explanatory power it has.
I think this is getting us off track, right? Because what I'm trying to understand is this, if shoe stealing fairies exist, right, it might be incredibly strongly predicted that my shoes would be missing.
Yeah.
But that just wouldn't be
the prior probability is awful.
Yeah,
it should be of interest, but basically,
you're putting this in a Bayesian framework, right? And I'm trying to get away from that. So I'm just trying to understand.
Okay, does he? Well, background. No. It goes into background knowledge. So when he talks about background knowledge, he's talking about what in canonical IBE is, I'm sure.
He talks about background knowledge. Yeah. So I mean, we're going to.
Hold on, Jack.
Yeah.
Hold on. Let me finish my thought here. So in this case, the background knowledge, it's not that it's not super valuable that the fairy theory explains the missing shoes, but the theory ultimately dies hard because the background knowledge destroys it. The plausibility of the theory.
So we can capture your notion there by dealing with background knowledge and go back to Dawes' list.
Well, no, because I'm not talking about prior probability. I'm saying Dawes' list leaves off one of the most important virtues, unless he might be wrapping it up in predictive power, in which case I would go back and say, actually, theism has great predictive power, but there's no actual predictions. So for instance, Einstein, in a sense, gave a theory that explained an observation, like the perihelion of Mercury or whatever, that was an existing enigma. Now, we already knew the true perihelion. So did he have do we get to say that his theory has predictive success? Well, it wasn't a prediction in the sense of, predicting it before the fact. It's a prediction. It has predictive power in the sense that it has explanatory power. And in that case, I would say that I don't like Dawes' language of prediction, but then I would say theism actually does have a lot of predictive power using that verbiage.
And how does it?
Well, in this case, as you pointed out, if you have, you were more charitable than I would be, but if you had like a God and you just took for granted that he desired to raise Jesus and have Jesus appear to the apostles, then that predicts him appearing to the apostles.
Yeah, right. And so, if you imagine some disposition in nature to raise Jesus from the dead, then Jesus rising from the dead will be predicted by that hypothesis, right?
And of course, that pushes the issue down to the prior probability, or in Dawes' language, the background knowledge, because we have it's going to take a lot of work to probably convince you that that's a plausible model. So basically, what I'd be doing, Jack, is I'd be giving you the same sorts of evidence I give other people, and you just have to translate it into your preferred Dawesian IBE thing.
Yeah, well, that's why I wanted to go through this list. So I just wanted to see whether you were giving me anything that would, convince Dawes or convince somebody influenced by Dawes, who had a view close to his criteria.
Yeah, I would focus a lot. I would spend a lot of time with you on background knowledge, kind of like with what's her name? Where did she go? I think she left. I forget what her name was, but
Haiti.
I was telling Haiti, look, if we had more time, I would talk to you about the plausibility that God exists and that God would choose to raise Jesus. And I do the same thing with you because that's background knowledge. And I would talk to you then about the predictive power. I think that.
So you want to say that for me, right, the you think that the theistic hypothesis integrates with my background knowledge better than any naturalistic hypothesis would?
No, what I'm saying is that I'd want to speak to your background knowledge, because what is your background knowledge? It's a bunch of proposition. It's like a noetic structure. It's a bunch of propositions, and it's a bunch of probabilities assigned to those propositions. And what I'd want to do is I'd want to tinker around in your background knowledge, because right now I don't think that your background knowledge would be very nice to the resurrection hypothesis, would it? So I'd need to spend some time with you talking about how likely it is that God exists, and how likely it is that Jesus is a real historical figure, and that God would raise Jesus from the dead. Those are all things I'd have to talk about with you before getting you to take seriously the resurrection hypothesis.
Right. So as it stands, you would think.
Yeah, as it stands, yeah.
It seems like
it
would score pretty low, the theistic hypothesis.
It would score, right. That's exactly right. It would score very low for you without going into those background knowledge issues. That's right.
All right. So I'm trying to remember, which ones have we covered so far? Well, let's.
I don't.
Here,
I'll go through them. I see ontological autonomy, testability, and so forth. And I don't remember how Daz defines each of these. I would say a number of these just are not relevant to areas of knowledge, whether history or philosophical beliefs. So like testability, I don't think that if I understand what he probably means by testability, which seems to overlap a lot with some other things. But anyways, for his
but naturalistic explanations would likely meet the criterion of testability, right? They might not.
Well, no, like hallucinations. The apostles hallucinated. That's a naturalistic explanation of their experience and what they said. But I don't see anything testable about that explanation.
Oh, but you can test, under what kinds of conditions hallucinations are likely or unlikely to occur and that kind of thing, right? So they're not really outside the scope.
But there's no testability for the hypothesis itself that the apostles hallucinated.
Well, if you mean, I guess I can grant you that. I wouldn't know if I came up with that explanation. I'm not really sure how I'd go about testing it.
I would say in general, historical beliefs in general.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I agree with you about that. But I guess the general problem, though, is that this is sort of where the stuff about progressive research programs comes in, right? Because with a naturalism, it's always tricky to talk about naturalism because I'm not actually a metaphysical naturalist, but let's say non-supernaturalism, right, or anti-supernaturalism, right? The point is that anti-supernaturalistic explanations, right, are going to, in general, have the criterion of testability. Going to generally have the virtue of testability, right?
I don't think that's true, Jack. I think, again, most historical theses aren't going to go through that. I think most philosophical theses aren't going to go through that. I think a lot of your psychological beliefs aren't going to go through that. I think that's quite limited. The testability.
My point is that with supernatural explanation, it doesn't seem like we get that, right? So it doesn't. Yeah. Let's just for the sake of argument, we can restrict testability to within the realm of the sciences, right? And I don't think it's actually true that psychological explanations are untestable, but fine, let's just restrict it to the scientific domain, right? The point is, what I'm saying is supernatural explanations don't seem like they ever really provide.
Right, I agree. Yeah, I think in that case, I think it's a lot like historical explanations, and in other genres. Again, a lot of philosophical explanations. I don't see testability.
I mean, interestingly, what Daz says is that in theory there could be supernatural explanations, right? Because what we can do is specify the if we're talking about theistic explanations, we can specify like divine desires, and then we can look and see if we can look for evidence that would then be consistent with that desire, right? So, like, if God had a desire, I mean, imagine that's kind of like how prayer experiments probably work, right? If we thought God had a desire to answer prayers, we could look maybe for evidence that prayers are generally answered or something like that, right? I'm not saying that's particularly good, strong evidence or anything. I'm just saying, in principle, there could be ways in which some supernatural explanation or theistic explanations could be testable, but it doesn't seem like whenever they are, they meet the tests, right? Would you agree with that?
I think that sounds right.
Okay, so we can just say with respect to testability, it's going to be that the theistic explanations don't score well at all.
Yeah,
So
which is true of which again, remember, is true of lots of categories of knowledge.
Yeah, it's true of lots of categories of knowledge, right? But the point is that
it doesn't. Yeah, and it doesn't. And like you said, it doesn't. Best explanations don't need to score high on each of the virtues. And what I'm telling you is, and what I'm telling you is, I'm telling you that what's going to make theism a good explanation, not theism, the resurrection a good explanation, is going to boil down to the power in the background knowledge and the predictive, what he calls predictive success. And again, I hasten to repeat, I don't like how Daz has uniquely, and nobody else, no other philosophers I'm aware of picked up his like the way he's done this. People still use canonical IBE, and I think a lot of this is redundant and like it's not very careful in my opinion. Like testability, I think the main virtues of testability can get wrapped up in explanatory power. Like there's no need to talk about testability in general. I think ontological economy and simplicity probably can be wrapped up into background knowledge and simplicity, and maybe just in simplicity. I don't know. I don't remember what informativeness was, but at the end of the day,
I think that has to do with specifying causal mechanisms.
Yeah, at the end of the day, we're talking like maybe just out of curiosity, how do we latch this on to Daz's personal theory here? I think it'd be more productive next time we chat. Like, let's just look at the evidence, and you can kind of decide what category it fits in. All that matters is you acknowledging that you can have like nothing in terms of testability, and it can still easily be a best explanation. And that's fine.
Well, my point, I was just interested. I mean, I sort of kind of like want to look at Christianity as kind of a package, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it just seems like if we look at it as a package, right, we're not going
to
virtuous explanatory framework, right? And I'm going to adduce basically Dazian criteria, I think, to evaluate.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And so that's sort of one of the reasons why, that's why I think it's going to be, for somebody like me, it's going to be a lot harder for me to sort of take the theistic hypothesis seriously in the case of the resurrection. Because, I mean, even if I granted that Jesus actually rose from the dead, right? Because, a lot of people would think that's like a very strong concession to make, right? Because they're going to be more likely, they're going to say it's a lot more likely that people were deluded or hallucinating, right? Or that the historical accounts are unreliable or whatever. They're going to want to leave that last, right? That, that Jesus just rose from the dead, they're going to say is very unlikely, right? But see, I just feel like, well, look, if I thought there was strong evidence that Jesus actually rose from the dead, like overwhelmingly strong evidence, whereby I had to conclude that he did rise from the dead, right? It just seems like it would take an enormous amount of evidence for me to then conclude from that. Like that would not be sufficient for me to like adopt a supernatural explanation, right? I'd need a lot more than that.
Well, yeah.
Rather than, in other words, in order to give up on my idea that there's some natural explanation that I don't have, right? Like think about something like violations, think about something like laws of nature, right? So if something seemed to be inconsistent with what I took the laws of nature to be, I would just sooner think that I had gotten the laws of nature wrong, right, than I would think that there was a supernatural explanation. So in order for me to get to the supernatural explanation, that's when you have to go through this, what seemed to me, extremely rigorous set of requirements, or well, maybe requirements is the wrong word, as you pointed out, but like, there'd be this rigorous set of evaluative criteria which would be brought to bear on the question. And it's hard for me to imagine how the theistic explanation would really get off the ground until it started to do things like become, testable, generate novel predictions, that kind of thing, right? In other words, to become basically.
But remember, you did say that testability. It's only so not being testable does not count against the theory. You said that yourself. All it is it's an opportunity.
What I'm saying is if it were testable and it met those tests,
it'd be great.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be like, oh well, maybe the correct thing to do is not think that, I had gotten sort of the natural facts wrong, but rather that there's something I haven't taken into account, which could be some type of supernatural explanation, which would normally just be off the table.
Yeah. And something to keep in mind too is like if you think a given thing is a best explanation, and I'm asking you why is it the best explanation, and you want to cite Dawesian criteria, ultimately I'm going to want you to justify the Dawesian criteria as well. I think that the regular IBE criteria are better cutting, they're sharper at, as they say, cutting things at the joints, not necessarily nature, but reason. And so, like, again, testability is kind of weird to talk about because so much of what we believe is disconnected from testability. Testability is a neat opportunity, but I can explain the virtue of testability by reducing it to other virtues. But I'm happy to talk about that stuff with you, man. You're a great person to have a conversation with. And so I'd love it. Unfortunately, it's just, it requires a lot of work.
Yeah, I think there are some other people here like Venus and Detroyer who would be interested also in talking with you about that. They don't all have I think Venus
Detroyer already had a conversation with him about the fine-tuning argument.
Yeah, I heard some of that, but I think Detroyer has not yet interacted with Blake on the resurrection, or very, very briefly only.
Right.
But I think, and he probably does, I imagine, is closer to kind of a Bayesian about these issues. So he probably is already on the same page with you in a lot of ways. But I don't think that he's going to think that there's going to be good reasons to think that.
Yeah, and I have to run, guys. I just
we'll pick this up another time, Blake.
Yeah, here's all, just in case it wasn't already clear. All I was trying to do with the resurrection is I imagine all of you came here starting with a particular level of credence in it, and you may not have been aware of this piece of evidence in favor of the resurrection. And so my only goal would have been to move you some degree closer to taking Christianity seriously as a result of that. And I'm not at all, I don't carry any delusion about it, being enough sufficient for most of you who have thought about this for a while by itself to actually carry you over into Christianity. But if you weren't aware of this particular evidence, it could have been one that made you think, oh, wow, that is a little bit of a tension that, even though it's not enough, it's a tension that I've got to deal with. And maybe Christianity looks a little bit better than it did before. And that's all I was really shooting for.